Good evening, everyone. My name is Lauren Armwood, and this is my visual argument. My visual is a photograph taken by Roberto Schmidt and located in a CNN article titled, "The George Floyd Protests Are Sparking a Surprising Debate in Black America." This article was written by John Blake and published on June 4th of this year, which was right in the middle of the most active time of the George Floyd protests. The phrase Black Lives Matter became an integral part of the American lexicon, and many Americans found themselves unable to separate the phrase from the organization. This confusion has caused many different opinions amongst Americans on what the words and the organization stand for. In recent discussions of social justice and judicial equality, a controversial issue has been whether the Black Lives Matter organization and its protesters are inherently violent. On the one hand, some argue that Black Lives Matter protesters are creating all of the violence. On the other hand, however, others argue that the violence begins with the police. I disagree with the "they say" portion of this argument that Black Lives Matter protesters are creating the violence with police because, as recent research has shown, a large portion of the protests have been peaceful. Along with the research are eyewitness testimony from various news outlets, various civilians, and even police members themselves, and video evidence from various protests that show the police have initiated the violence when protests became violent. The reason behind the visual is, quote, "because there is news coverage of Black Lives Matter protesters destroying buildings, starting riots, and creating violent situations," end quote. This reason is incorrect because there is actually no proof that actual Black Lives Matter protesters are starting the violence during these protests. In fact, according to an article by Harmeet Kaur on CNN.com, the report by the U.S. Crisis Project found that, quote, "about 93% of racial justice protests in the U.S. since the death of George Floyd have been peaceful and non-destructive," end quote. The warrant is faulty because, like all motivational warrants, it is an assessment of the audience's values. In this case, it's that you have to automatically believe that Black Lives Matter protesters and the organization are inherently violent. So anytime there is a assessment or a judgment of audience's values, there can never be a general consensus because no full audience has the full same views and the same values. The accurate reason for this visual argument is that Black Lives Matter protesters are staying peaceful, but the police or even counter protesters are actually the ones inciting violence. This is a good reason because of the studies done by different organizations and investigations completed by law enforcement agencies across the country that show that Black Lives Matter protesters are not the ones inciting any violence. My warrant is that the police are inherently violent, and this should be an accepted warrant because of the visible militarization of the police and the record number of civilian deaths that are occurring at the hands of the police, while violent crime is actually going down in the country and has been for years. The report I spoke about from the U.S. Crisis Project shows that nearly 5% of the Black Lives Matter protests were met with force by the authorities, compared to 1% of other demonstrations, and that violent demonstrations in Portland increased from 53% to 62% after federal agents arrived. This is documented proof that peaceful protests are being met with violence from the police, and other protesters who have been identified as members of white supremacy hate groups are actually the ones that are starting the rioting and vandalizing buildings and fires and causing fires. This report from the U.S. Crisis Project is a good source as it is a study spearheaded by Princeton University's Bridging Divides Initiative, which collects and analyzes real-time data on demonstrations and political violence in the U.S., and it is also partially funded by the government. So if there was any bias, you would assume that the bias would not allow for any evidence or any proof to come out that shows government agents in a violent or negative light. In closing, my argument shows that Black Lives Matter protesters are not the ones inciting violence with the police. My discussion of Black Lives Matter protesters being violent during protests is in fact addressing the larger matter of people's racial biases and values. These values and biases have been impacting members of the American collective society for generations, and it's still having an impact today. Thank you so much.